My MIL gave my wedding dress to her daughter, so I bought her dream venue first. My name is JoJo Siwa. I'm 28 years old, a creative director at an art-focused branding agency in Austin. I specialize in rebranding legacy institutions, museums, architecture firms, publishing houses, so they can speak to the next generation without losing their identity. Ironically, for all my training in clarity and storytelling, I couldn't see how my own life was about to fracture. I was engaged to Wesley Whitmore, the youngest VP at his family's communications conglomerate, Whitmore Media Group. We met 3 years ago when I helped redesign the public image of a historical jazz venue his company had acquired. He was intelligent, careful, precise with words in a way that made you feel like he was always 3 steps ahead. I fell for that steadiness. After years of working in fast-moving, often chaotic creative environments, being with someone so centered felt like safety. His family was another story. The Whitmores were Austin legacy. His mother, Cassandra Whitmore, ran one of the most influential art galleries in the city and moved through every space like she owned the air in it. She wasn't overtly cruel, just calculated. Every compliment carried an undertone. Every question about my work felt like a quiz I hadn't studied for. I knew I wasn't their first choice. Cass had once casually mentioned over brunch that Wesley had previously dated the daughter of a senator. She said it the way people mention missed weather forecasts lightly, but pointedly. I nodded, smiled, kept my posture perfect. The dress was supposed to be neutral ground, something I could control. My mother passed away 5 years ago, and while she never got to meet Wesley, she'd left behind a trunk of fabric scraps, sketchbooks, and pattern notes. She had been a seamstress for nearly 30 years. I worked with my best friend Janelle, a stylist and designer, to create a custom gown using fabric from that trunk. The base of the dress was a soft ivory silk that shimmered in morning light. The lining was cut from my mother's last project, an unfinished cathedral-length veil she had been making for someone else's wedding. It felt poetic, repurposing it for mine. The beadwork was subtle, inlaid with small accents, inspired by my mom's garden. The whole thing took 6 months, 3 fittings, and 100 quiet nights spent reviewing sketches with Janelle at my kitchen table. Wesley had suggested storing the dress at his family's house. Our apartment's too small, he said, and Mom has that temperature-controlled storage closet in the guest wing. She'll keep it safe. At the time, I agreed. There was no reason not to trust him. I sent the dress over in a garment bag with Janelle's final tag still pinned to the neckline. 2 weeks later, I dropped by the Whitmore estate after a meeting downtown. Cass didn't answer the door, but the housekeeper let me in. I told her I just needed to grab something from the closet. She nodded, went back to folding towels. When I opened the door to the storage room, the first thing I noticed was that the garment bag was missing. At first, I thought maybe she'd moved it, but when I checked the coat closet, the linen cabinet, and even the laundry room, it was nowhere. I texted Cass. No reply. I called twice, straight to voicemail. I was about to leave when I heard voices coming from the back garden. I followed the sound to the sunroom and froze behind the curtain. There she was, Cass standing beside her daughter Elise, who was modeling a white gown on a portable platform while a tailor made notes nearby. I recognized the shimmer of the silk before anything else. The neckline was higher now, the sleeves capped instead of sheer, but the lining, that pale blush with green embroidery, was unmistakable. It was my mother's work. Elise twirled, laughing, and said, "It's perfect. I can't believe you saved this for me." Cass smiled. "Of course I did. This silhouette flatters you far more than it did JoJo. She's a visionary. But Elise, you're timeless." I backed away before they saw me. I made it to the car without remembering how my legs moved. I sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. I called Wesley. He answered on the second ring, cheerful, when I told him what happened. There was a pause, then a sigh. "Babe, I think you're overreacting. It's just a dress. Elise has her engagement photo shoot next week. Mom said you were still making tweaks to yours, so she thought." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I drove home in silence, dressless, voiceless, the ring on my finger suddenly heavier than ever. That night, I opened the sketchbook my mother had left me and stared at the original dress design, wondering how many more things I would have to redraw from scratch just to be respected. The morning after the dress incident, I woke up in a bed that suddenly felt too wide. Wesley had left early for work, just like any other Thursday, like nothing had happened. He'd kissed me on the forehead and said something about trying to smooth things over with Mom, but the words had landed with no weight. I stayed in bed for another hour, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow and uneven, the hum reminding me that even machines could lose rhythm over time. When I finally got up, I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because routine was the only thing that felt familiar. That afternoon, I called Janelle and told her everything. She didn't speak at first. I could hear her breathing, slow and heavy, and then came the two words I'd been avoiding. "That's theft." I wanted to argue. I wanted to protect Wesley, to believe his family was just careless, not cruel, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Elise wore the dress like she had inherited it, like it was always meant for her, and Cass had orchestrated every detail with a steady hand and a smile when Janelle offered to come over. I said no. I needed space to think. Over the next few days, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Wesley kept calling it a misunderstanding. He offered to pay for another dress, said he'd talk to Elise and Cass, but never followed through. I realized he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was trying to wait me out, to let the anger pass so we could get back to planning a wedding that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. When I asked him point blank if he thought what his mother did was wrong, he hesitated, then said, "I think she meant well." That sentence sat in my chest like a brick. I didn't need him to burn bridges. I just needed him to recognize that a bridge had been crossed without my consent. The emotional weight of it all began to chip away at the surface I'd worked so hard to maintain. At work, I smiled through meetings and delivered creative briefs on time. But something behind my eyes had shifted. Daniel, my colleague and friend, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You don't have to tell me what's going on, but if you need space, take it." I nodded, grateful that someone saw it without needing the full picture. By the end of the week, Cass had taken the silence as permission. She began involving Elise in more of the planning. She booked a florist without asking. She sent me an email titled "Updated Guest List" that included people I had never met, but with last names that carried legacy weight in Austin. I felt like I was being phased out of my own event when I pushed back. She responded with a smile and a phrase she'd use often in the coming weeks, JoJo. "We're just trying to elevate the experience." I'd heard that tone before. It was the same one gallery curators used when removing an original installation to replace it with something more palatable for donors. The final straw wasn't even the dress, it was the venue. We had originally chosen a small vineyard about an hour outside the city. Intimate, rustic. surrounded by fields of lavender and old oak trees. It reminded me of my childhood summers with my mom, when we'd drive through back roads just to find antique stores and stop for peach ice cream along the way. Cass had agreed to it at first, but only because she thought it was temporary. Now, she was floating a new suggestion, the Overlook Estate. The Overlook was her dream venue, an architectural marvel built into a limestone ridge overlooking the river, reserved mostly for the elite. It was where she had hosted two of her gallery's biggest fundraising galas, and where Elise had done a fashion shoot the year before. She presented it as an upgrade and said she'd already spoken to the director. They'll make an exception for us. The Whitmore name still opens doors, she said, handing me a brochure I never asked for. I held it like it was radioactive. I knew what this was. She was rewriting the narrative. In her version, I was the confused creative in need of refinement, the bride whose own vision was too small for the family she was marrying into. Her emails started including Elise in CC. Her messages to Wesley grew warmer, more frequent. I wasn't just being overruled, I was being replaced. It wasn't the dress, the guest list, or the venue that broke me. It was the realization that my identity, my memories, and my mother's legacy had all been reduced to decoration in someone else's production. That night, I sat on the balcony of our apartment with a glass of wine and the old Polaroid photo of my mom in her studio, pins in her mouth, measuring tape around her neck. I traced the edges of the photo with my thumb, trying to hear her voice again, but there was only wind and silence. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a wedding band rehearsing through open windows. The irony didn't escape me. I didn't know it yet, but the version of me who once believed I could win approval through patience and politeness was dying quietly in that moment. Something else would rise from it. But first, I had to watch everything fall apart. 3 days after Cass handed me the Overlook Estate brochure, I found myself standing alone in that very venue, not as a bride-to-be, but as a woman grasping for clarity in a storm that had stopped pretending to be weather. I told Wesley I needed time to think, and he didn't fight me. That, more than anything, scared me. I had always imagined that the hardest part of love was disagreement, but silence can feel like a deeper betrayal, especially when it comes wrapped in calm. Reasonable tones that quietly erase what hurts you. The Overlook was beautiful, no doubt, vaulted ceilings with river-facing windows, marble staircases that looked like they belonged in opera houses, polished floors that echoed when you walked. I should have felt awed, maybe even excited. Instead, I felt like I was trespassing in a life that didn't belong to me. This wasn't the place I had imagined saying my vows. It didn't hold a single memory, a single scent that reminded me of anything real. It was Cass's memory palace, not mine. Every surface seemed designed to impress people who weren't invited to witness the quiet things that make a marriage. Back in the car, I sat with my phone in my hand for 20 minutes before calling Janelle. When she picked up, I didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. Finally, I asked her the question that had been pressing into my chest for days. What if I'm marrying someone who can't protect me from his own family? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, maybe the better question is, do you want to be married to someone who doesn't see why you'd need protection at all? That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up scrolling through old photos of Wesley and me during our first year together. We looked happy, and maybe we were, but I also noticed something else. I was always the one adapting, changing my outfits to blend into his country club circles. adjusting my tone when speaking to Cass so I wouldn't sound too assertive, editing parts of myself without even realizing it. The most painful realization wasn't that he had changed. It was that I had, and too quietly to notice until now. By the end of the week, Cass had moved forward as if nothing had gone wrong. She posted a photo on Instagram of Elise twirling in what used to be my dress, captioned, "Whitmore Elegance," reimagined. The comments were filled with hearts and praise. Perfect for her coloring, such grace, classic Elise. I stared at the image for a long time, not out of jealousy, but out of grief. The dress had been a bridge between me and my mother. Now it was a billboard for someone else's narrative. I called the bridal atelier where I'd stored the design files and sketches. They had archived them, and the staff member who answered was kind but hesitant. "I just want you to know," she said softly. "We were all rooting for your original gown. It had so much soul." I thanked her and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the file I'd been avoiding. Guest seating chart, revised by Cass Whitmore. It was more than a spreadsheet. It was a declaration of power. My college roommate, whom Cass once called a little too loud, had been moved to the back. My cousins, previously in the second row, were now mixed in with vendor staff. Elise's sorority sisters were suddenly front and center. I stared at the cells on the screen, color-coded in a palette Cass described as dignified neutrals, and I felt something unravel. It wasn't rage, it wasn't even sadness. It was the clarity of knowing I was no longer steering my own future. I clicked close on the file without saving, stood up from the couch, and looked at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't recognize the woman staring back, not because she looked different, but because I couldn't remember the last time she'd said no out loud. Wesley came home late that night. His tie was loose, eyes tired. I asked him if he'd spoken to his mother about the dress. He shook his head, said it wasn't the right moment, said he didn't want to escalate things before the family dinner this weekend. Then he asked if I liked the new layout for the rehearsal dinner table. One Cass had finalized with Elise's help. That was when I knew he wasn't going to change this dynamic. Not because he didn't care, but because this was the only way he knew how to keep the peace. He had been raised in a house where silence was strategy and appearance was sacred. Speaking up wasn't just hard for him, it was foreign. That weekend, I showed up to the family dinner out of obligation, not hope. Cass greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and called me sweet girl in front of her guests. Elise wore the dress, not to provoke, but because to her, it really was hers now. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I sat at the table, fork in hand, listening to a conversation about signature cocktails and imported orchids. Nobody noticed that I had stopped participating. They only saw that the smile stayed on my face. Later that night, Wesley reached for my hand as we walked to the car. I let him, but inside, something had already left the building, and what was forming in its place wasn't rage or revenge, it was resolve. The Monday after that dinner, I canceled my meetings for the morning and made an appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Lane Patel, and she specialized in family dynamics and boundary recovery. I found her online after reading a post titled, "How to Stay Yourself While Marrying into a Dominant Family." The irony wasn't lost on me. I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine I couldn't focus on, wondering if she'd see me as dramatic. But the moment I walked into her office, a warm room with minimal furniture and no pretense, I felt like something had shifted already. She didn't ask me to explain everything. She just said, "Start with the first time you felt invisible." I told her about the dress, about my mom, about the way Cass said "sweet girl" like it was a leash. I told her how Wesley had once promised that we'd build a life that belonged to us, not his legacy, and how I hadn't realized until now that what he meant was I'd build the life and he'd stay quiet. Dr. Patel listened carefully, jotting things down only occasionally, then said something simple. You're grieving, not just the dress, not just the version of your wedding you imagined. You're grieving the version of this relationship that you believed was safe. That sentence hung in the air between us. It didn't sting. It clarified. I left her office with a quiet mind and a louder question. If I was grieving something that wasn't gone yet, maybe I wasn't meant to hold on to it at all. That night, I cooked dinner for myself and didn't wait for Wesley to get home. When he walked in, I told him I'd booked a therapy session. He nodded like I'd said I got a haircut, then asked if I'd seen the RSVP list Cass had updated. I didn't respond. Some answers don't come in words. They come in decisions. Over the next 2 weeks, I began reclaiming small pieces of my power. I moved the dress sketches and fabric samples back into my own studio. I unfollowed Elise on social media to stop the algorithm from feeding me back images of my stolen memories. I started saying no more freely, not to provoke, but to test the strength of my own voice again. Janelle noticed immediately. She said, "You're quieter, but not in the scared way, in the loaded way, like something's building." I smiled for the first time in weeks. What was building wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a blueprint for resistance. If Cass wanted a spectacle, I'd give her something else entirely, something she couldn't anticipate. I began looking into venues again, not to find an alternative, but to understand what Cass hadn't secured yet. That's when I found it. In the original email thread between her and the director of Overlook, she mentioned they were awaiting confirmation from the family trust, which meant the estate wasn't actually booked. It was pending. All that power she pretended to wield was a bluff. The door was still unlocked. She just counted on me never checking the knob. I called an old client of mine, Harriet Longfellow, who had once asked me to redesign the website for a historic estate just outside Fredericksburg. Her family had owned it for generations and had only recently started allowing private events. The estate was called the Ardent House. It was everything Cass wanted Overlook to be, only quieter and more exclusive. Its guest list didn't rely on old money. It relied on real relationships. I asked Harriet if the June weekend was still open. It was, and she said something I'll never forget. "JoJo, if you want it, it's yours. And unlike some people, I don't charge you extra just to belong." I didn't book it that day. I wasn't ready to act yet, but knowing I had the option changed the energy. I started sleeping again. I showed up to dinner with Wesley's extended family and didn't flinch when Cass made a passive remark about second-tier designers. I smiled and passed the salad bowl. Let her think I was digesting the insult. In truth, I was digesting her strategy. She thrived on elegance as armor. Her real fear was being outmaneuvered in silence. One night, as Wesley scrolled through his tablet reviewing floral mock-ups, I asked him what legacy meant to him. He said something about family history, shared moments, and carrying tradition forward. I nodded and said nothing, then asked if he thought I would ever truly be part of that legacy. He looked up, unsure if it was a trick question. Then he said, "I think you already are." I didn't correct him, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had been orbiting their legacy, trying not to fall out of gravity. But now I realized I needed to create my own atmosphere, and fast. The next morning, I called Harriet back. I told her I'd like to reserve the Ardent House, Not for the date Cass wanted, for the weekend before it, quiet, clean. No press releases, just secured. I transferred the deposit before breakfast, and as I sipped my coffee, watching the confirmation email come through, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Not triumph, not revenge, just relief, like standing on solid ground again. 3 days after confirming the booking with the Ardent House, I visited the property in person. Harriet greeted me at the gate in a linen jumpsuit and sandals, holding a clipboard like a woman who didn't need to prove she was in charge. She gave me a quiet tour of the grounds, walking slowly past the stone courtyard, the orchard-lined path leading to the ceremony arch, the oak tree with wind chimes she'd installed after her mother's passing. Everything about the space felt intentional but unforced. I could already see the table settings, the floral colors, the kind of wedding that didn't scream money but whispered meaning. It wasn't the loudest place I'd seen. It was just the most honest. We finalized the details in under an hour. I signed a confidentiality agreement, added a clause to block all PR mentions until I gave personal approval, and added a 3-week buffer on both sides of the wedding date. It cost more than I'd budgeted, but less than my peace of mind had already paid. Harriet didn't ask why I needed exclusivity. She just looked at me with quiet understanding and said, "Some moments need protection before celebration." That night, I didn't tell Wesley what I had done, not because I wanted to lie, but because I needed to hold something that was fully mine. He came home with a bottle of wine and said his mother had locked in a tentative hold on Overlook for Elise's engagement party. Not the wedding, just the party. I smiled and poured us each a glass. He had no idea that the venue Cass actually wanted for Elise's wedding was now contractually mine for the entire month. No idea that I had just rendered her leverage useless. All without saying a single unkind word. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the days that followed, I leaned into this new energy. I reached out to a dressmaker in Marfa named Luisa Cortez, a designer I'd followed on Instagram for years, but never dared to message. Her work was intimate, architectural, and steeped in cultural memory. I told her my story. I didn't embellish or sanitize, just sent her a voice note that said, "My mother was a seamstress. My dress was taken. I want something that speaks for me now." Louisa replied the next morning with a simple, "Come out next weekend. Let's begin." When I told Janelle, she cried, not out of sadness but relief. She said she was proud of me, that I had stopped waiting for someone to hand me a different ending. I didn't know how to respond, so I hugged her and said thank you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone stand beside you without needing to explain why you're finally standing. Meanwhile, Cass was still performing her role with elegance and precision. She invited me to a luncheon hosted at her gallery and introduced me to the wives of 3 major donors as our JoJo. The artist in the family now. The phrasing wasn't accidental. It wasn't a compliment. It was possession dressed up as inclusion. I nodded politely and took a sip of sparkling water while watching her eyes scan the room for approval. Elise was seated 2 spots away, glowing in a champagne dress and effortlessly absorbing every compliment about her upcoming celebration. I smiled at both of them, and for the first time, it didn't feel fake. It felt like armor. The turning point came during a private planning meeting Cass arranged with her preferred wedding coordinator. She scheduled it without asking me, then sent me the invite as if it were mandatory. I showed up, on time, and sat through an hour-long presentation about color schemes, table shapes, and something called legacy brand alignment. When the coordinator asked what I envisioned for the ceremony itself, Cass cut in and said, "We're thinking traditional Catholic service, though of course JoJo's side can be incorporated gently." I didn't flinch. I just said, "Actually, I've already secured a venue, one that reflects my mother's roots and mine." The silence in the room stretched. Cass looked at me like I had spoken another language. The coordinator smiled awkwardly and asked, "Oh, you mean a backup venue?" I shook my head. "No, I mean the venue." Cass's lips tightened. "JoJo, I don't think you understand the visibility we need from this wedding." I met her gaze calmly. "Cass, I understand perfectly. That's why I took care of it myself." I didn't say the name of the estate. I didn't need to. I just left the room after that, calm and certain, and drove home to finalize the first round of fittings with Louisa. The fabric we selected was raw silk dyed with indigo and washed in eucalyptus. The inner lining would be made from a restored swatch of my mother's last handmade curtain, something I'd kept in storage for years. As I ran my fingers over the material, I felt something come full circle. I hadn't just reclaimed the space. I had reclaimed the meaning. What Cass still didn't know was that the weekend she was eyeing for Elise's dream wedding was now contractually blocked under my name, with signed legal terms preventing any conflict of use. Her dream was now my quiet boundary. And Elise. She hadn't said a word since that luncheon, not because she was angry, but because she hadn't realized yet that the power she thought was inherited had already shifted rooms. Wesley found out 2 days later, but not from me. He came home from work with his tie already loosened, a look I had come to associate with his version of discomfort. He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter, then stood there silently before speaking. "My mom called me this afternoon. She said the Ardent House is booked for the entire month of June, under your name." I kept my gaze on the stovetop, where a kettle was just beginning to hiss. "That's correct," I said. There was no anger in my tone, just finality. He ran a hand through his hair like he wanted to argue, but wasn't sure where to begin. "Why didn't you tell me?" I turned off the kettle and replied, "Because I needed one thing in this wedding that wasn't negotiated." He sat down at the dining table and exhaled. "She's furious, says you blindsided her." I didn't respond right away. I poured tea into 2 cups and slid one toward him. "She's been writing the entire script for months." "Wesley, I just decided to write 1 page on my own." He looked at the cup but didn't touch it. "I just wish we could have handled it together." He said. That word "together" landed oddly. Not because I didn't believe in partnership, but because we hadn't actually operated as a team in weeks. I stared at him and asked, gently, "Would you have supported me if I told you before I booked it?" The pause before his answer was all I needed. The next few days passed in a quiet truce. Cass didn't call. Elise posted a vague story on social media about plans shifting. "People surprising you." I assumed it was directed at me, but I didn't engage. What surprised me more was Wesley's silence. He didn't push. He didn't apologize. He just moved around the apartment like a man slowly realizing that neutrality isn't protection, it's complicity. I watched him try to reconcile his mother's loss of control with his own image of peacekeeping. The realization was subtle, but I could feel it. Something in him was breaking, and for once, it wasn't me. I spent that week traveling to Marfa for my second fitting with Louisa. The dress was taking shape, strong lines, natural drape, no corset. It felt like me. During the fitting, Louisa pinned a section of fabric near my waist and said, "You're standing differently this time." I smiled and said, "I feel heavier and lighter at the same time." She nodded like she'd heard it before. While I was gone, Cass reached out, not to me, of course to Janelle. She sent an email under the guise of checking in and asked for a list of my preferred photographers, florists, and vendors. Janelle forwarded it to me with a note. She's trying to rebuild the blueprint. Your silence is scaring her. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed something I had suspected for weeks. Cass didn't fear confrontation. She feared irrelevance. And the more I stopped performing approval-seeking rituals, the less control she had. When I returned to Austin, I found Wesley waiting with dinner already made. It wasn't a peace offering. It was an olive branch without a clear target. We sat on the couch eating pasta in quiet bites. Then he said, I think my mom feels like you're rejecting the family. I put my fork down. I'm rejecting control. If that's the same thing in her eyes, then maybe she's not seeing me clearly. He nodded slowly, then added, I'm starting to see it now. I didn't before. It was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. Later that night, I found an email from the Ardent House event coordinator confirming the final payment and the locked guest list. It felt like a signature on a boundary, clean, cold, and necessary. I wrote back confirming everything, then closed the laptop and stood by the window for a long time. The city lights below flickered like signals in the dark. Somewhere across town, Cass was probably rewriting Elise's timeline, scrambling for another venue, recrafting her speeches, but none of it mattered now. The center of gravity had shifted, and for once, I wasn't the one adjusting. The next family gathering was Wesley's cousin's engagement dinner, hosted at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the lake. Cass greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a careful smile. Elise avoided eye contact. The table conversation swirled around summer plans, postponed trips, and the vague mention of venue transitions. At one point, Cass raised a glass and said, well, wherever the wedding ends up, we'll make it beautiful. Legacy always finds its place. I smiled and took a sip of water. Yes, it does, I said. And this time, I meant it differently. The party ended without drama. No confrontations, no declarations, but the tension was unmistakable. I walked away with Wesley's arm lightly resting around my shoulder. But in my mind, I walked alone, not because I was isolated, but because I had chosen a path that required clarity more than comfort, and for the first time in months. I didn't feel like a guest in my own story. I felt like the host. It was late on a Wednesday evening when the moment I'd quietly waited for finally came, though not in the form I expected. Wesley came home earlier than usual, jacket slung over his shoulder, face pale, jaw tight. He didn't say much at first, just placed his keys on the entry table and stood silently, his eyes scanning the apartment like he was searching for something he hadn't noticed until now. I asked if everything was okay. He said he had met with his mother that afternoon, unplanned, after she'd shown up at his office without warning. What followed, according to him, was the most uncomfortable hour of his adult life. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't begged. She had simply said she was disappointed in him, that he had let the family down by allowing me to act independently, that her plans were falling apart, and Elise was now in limbo because of my lack of cooperation. Wesley paused after saying that phrase, then added with a bitter smile, as if Elise's life depends on where you stand. He sat down at the edge of the couch and stared at the floor. She said you're doing all of this to spite her, that you took the Ardent House out of revenge. I kept my expression still. I had no interest in defending something that didn't need defending. He looked up, waiting for a reaction, and when I didn't offer one, he finally asked, was it revenge I answered slowly. No. It was remembering that I deserve to choose what my wedding looks like. It was claiming back something that belonged to me and was taken without care or apology. If that feels like revenge to her, that's not mine to carry. The air between us went still. Then Wesley said something I hadn't heard from him before. She told me that if I let this go forward, I'm choosing you over the family. I waited, and I said yes. He didn't look for approval. He didn't say it like a hero. He said it like a man exhausted by pretending balance was possible. I walked to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and placed it on the coffee table. That's the first real boundary I've seen you draw since all this started. He nodded slowly. It won't be the last. What came after wasn't loud. There was no grand apology or dramatic vow, just small, deliberate actions that finally aligned with words. He emailed Cass that night and told her all decisions regarding the wedding would now go through me. He said he'd no longer be attending meetings she scheduled without my consent. He asked her to respect our time and choices, not as punishment, but as practice. He didn't ask for her understanding. He didn't try to soften the blow. The next morning, he showed me the email before sending it, not for permission, but for transparency. And I realized we were starting to build something honest, not just convenient. The fallout was immediate. Cass called me the next afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was calm, clipped, and full of phrases like a shame. Such wasted potential, and I had such high hopes for our collaboration. I deleted it without replaying. Elise followed up a day later with a text that simply said, "Guess you win." I stared at those 3 words for a long time. They didn't feel like a concession. They felt like a deflection. Like someone still trying to frame this as a game she lost instead of a boundary I drew. I didn't respond. That weekend, I had my final fitting with Louisa. The dress was complete, no veil, no train, just an unstructured silhouette with hand-stitched floral seams. A subtle nod to my mother's old embroidery style. When I stepped onto the platform, Louisa adjusted a single fold near my waist and stepped back. "You're ready," she said, and I was. Not just for the dress, but for the life that would begin once I walked down that aisle. When I returned to Austin, Wesley had rearranged the guest room into a planning space for me. He didn't say much, just handed me a fresh folder of RSVPs, notes from the Ardent House team, and a small envelope with a note inside that read, "I see you now." There was no flourish, no speech, just clarity, for once. I wasn't the only one carrying the weight of what had happened, and I didn't feel alone. The wedding was now 6 weeks away. Cass hadn't reached out again. Elise had posted a new story with the caption, "Learning to Pivot with Grace," followed by a photo of an unrelated venue. The Whitmore circle remained silent, perhaps regrouping, perhaps retreating, but none of that mattered anymore. I wasn't waiting for closure from them. I had already given it to myself. The final phase was beginning, not with a shout, but with a quiet kind of power, one that didn't need approval to stand tall. The morning of the wedding came quietly, without thunder or grand rehearsal, just the soft rustle of trees around the Ardent House and the muted clinking of glasses being placed gently on linen-covered tables. It wasn't the kind of venue people bragged about on Instagram. There were no ice sculptures or drone shots, but it was the only place that had ever felt like mine. Harriet greeted me with a quiet hug and a smile that said everything was already handled. There were 15 rows of hand-carved wooden chairs, each one facing the orchard path that led to a natural arch made of eucalyptus and wild roses. No string quartet, no imported orchids, just soft wind and clean sky. Janelle arrived early, carrying my dress in its cotton garment bag and a small velvet box with a note from Louisa. Inside was a single-stitched message on linen. This time, you are walking in as yourself. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even meant to be read aloud. But it stayed with me as I changed. The dress slipped on without needing adjustment. There were no fasteners to fight with, no corset to reshape me, just one tie at the waist and a neckline that sat where I liked it best. I looked in the mirror and saw not a bride, but a woman who had stopped asking permission. Wesley was already waiting in the garden courtyard with his brother, who served as his best man. He wore a simple gray suit with no pocket square, no boutonniere, just a watch his grandfather had given him years ago. As I stepped out into the aisle, the only music playing was the wind brushing through the trees. There were 42 guests in total. My aunt from El Paso, Daniel from the agency, Janelle, a few college friends. No one came out of obligation. No one had to be reminded who I was. Cass was not in attendance. Neither was Elise. Their absence wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a choice, made on their terms, accepted on mine. The ceremony lasted 12 minutes. No priest, no officiant in robes, just Harriet, who had quietly gotten certified as a celebrant when she saw where the story was going. She spoke softly, introducing the ceremony not with formality, but with clarity. Today is about what was chosen, not what was expected, when it came time to exchange vows. Wesley didn't pull out a piece of paper. He simply said, "Thank you for waiting for me to grow into this moment. I see it now. I see you. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. My vow was simple too. You don't need to protect me. You just need to stand beside me when I protect myself." We said yes. We kissed. People clapped. And just like that, it was done. The reception was held in the orchard under strands of warm lights. No speeches, no 5-tiered cake, just food that tasted like my childhood and wine that Harriet had brought from a friend's vineyard. The dress didn't get stained. The sky didn't cloud over. Everything about the day felt like it belonged to the people in the room and no one else. Late into the evening, as guests drifted home and the candles burned low, Wesley and I walked barefoot through the orchard, still in our wedding clothes. He asked me if I felt like I'd won. I thought about that for a long time before answering. I don't feel like I won. I feel like I stopped losing. The following week, a printed envelope arrived at our apartment. Inside was a formal invitation to Elisa's new engagement party, now scheduled at a boutique hotel in downtown Austin. The venue was fine, generic, but fine. The note attached said, "Hope you'll join us. No hard feelings." I placed it in a drawer without comment. There were no hard feelings, but there was also no longer a need to perform unity where it didn't exist. Wesley didn't push. He simply said, "We can send a gift." That was enough. 2 days later, Cass called. I let it ring. Then I answered. Her tone was colder than usual, but even that was familiar by now. She said she'd heard the ceremony was tasteful, that it was unexpectedly mature. I said thank you. Then she added, "I suppose this means Elise won't be using the Ardent House after all." I replied simply, "No, that time has passed." She didn't respond right away, just a breath, followed by, "You've certainly surprised me." "JoJo," I smiled into the silence and said, "I surprised myself too." That night, I framed a photo from the wedding, not one of me and Wesley at the altar, but one of me standing alone in the orchard before the guests arrived. The light behind me, the dress falling naturally against my body, the look on my face calm, settled, unshaken. I hung it in the hallway outside our bedroom, a reminder that sometimes power doesn't need to roar, sometimes it just needs to stand still and stay rooted. A year passed faster than I expected, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally real. The week of our anniversary. Wesley and I went back to the Arden house, not for a celebration, but for quiet. Harriet had invited us to spend a few days there as guests, not clients. The vineyard was greener than I remembered, and the orchard had bloomed early that spring. We stayed in the guest cottage with creaky floors and a view of the hills that reminded me what peace actually felt like. No schedule, no event, just mornings of black coffee on the porch and evenings of slow meals without phones. Since the wedding, life had shifted in steady ways. Wesley and I started couples therapy, not because we were broken, but because we both agreed that building something healthy needed maintenance, not just repair. It wasn't always easy. He was still learning how to speak when silence had always been his shield. I was still learning how to trust that when I stood firm. I wouldn't be left standing alone, but we kept showing up. That became the new definition of commitment in our marriage, not perfection, just presence. Cass didn't reach out for 3 months after the wedding. Then, one day in October, I received a formal invitation to a gallery event she was hosting. The envelope was handwritten, the tone almost neutral. The card said, "You're welcome to join us if your schedule allows." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Wesley asked if I wanted to go. I said I'd think about it. The truth is, I didn't feel the need to reclaim space I never asked to be in. But I went anyway, not for her, but to see if I could enter that world without shrinking again. The gallery was exactly as I remembered, spotless, curated, strategically lit. Cass greeted me with her usual elegance, a faint smile that didn't stretch too far. We exchanged brief pleasantries. She introduced me to a few patrons as Wesley's wife, JoJo, who works in creative direction. The words were factual, not affectionate, but not dismissive. I noticed Elise across the room, dressed in emerald green, talking to a group of younger artists. She looked up, saw me, and gave the smallest nod. Not warmth, not anger, just acknowledgement. We didn't talk that night, but a week later, I got a message from Elise asking if I'd be open to meeting for coffee. I said yes. We met at a small bookstore cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. She arrived on time, without makeup, and ordered chamomile tea. The first thing she said was, "I didn't want the dress. Not like that." I didn't respond immediately. I let her keep going. She told me Cass had framed it as a solution, not a theft, said I wasn't using it, said it would be better for Elise to have it than for it to sit in storage. I asked her if she believed that. She shook her head. I didn't then. I definitely don't now. There was no apology, but there was something more honest. Elise looked at me and said, "You scared her, not with your voice, with your silence." I took a sip of coffee and said, "It wasn't silence, it was space." She nodded slowly. Well, it worked. Since then, our relationship has been polite, not close, but not tense. Cass continues to orbit the edges of our lives, present at major holidays, carefully rehearsed at family dinners. She still comments on my outfit sometimes, still pauses a little too long when I talk about work, but she no longer attempts to manage the narrative. She knows now that I will not hand it to her. One of the most unexpected changes came from other women, after the wedding. Janelle posted a story about my dress and tagged Luisa's studio. The caption read, "When power looks like soft fabric and sharp memory, it got reshared more than I imagined." A week later, I received a message from a woman in Chicago who said she was also trying to plan a wedding while navigating a mother-in-law who insisted on rewriting everything. She asked me how I stayed calm. I told her the truth. You don't stay calm, you stay clear. Clarity makes room for dignity. We kept writing. Then more women joined. It turned into a monthly video call, then a small group chat. Quiet stories of reclaiming voice. Not revenge, it became something real. One evening, I stood at the bookshelf in our apartment, adjusting the framed photo from our wedding. Next to it was a shadow box, holding a fabric swatch from the original dress my mother and I had dreamed about, the one that was never worn. I didn't display it to mourn what was lost. I displayed it to remember what was reclaimed. That piece of fabric no longer represented pain. It represented a woman who learned that softness was not weakness, that silence could be strength, that you don't have to destroy someone else's world to stop them from shrinking yours. A few weeks ago, I was asked to speak at a small workshop hosted by a friend of mine who runs a creative incubator for women. The topic was navigating conflict while holding on to your integrity. I almost said no, not because I didn't have anything to share, but because I hadn't realized until that moment how far I'd come from the woman who once sat in a guest closet searching for a missing dress. But I said yes. And when I showed up, the room was full of women I didn't know yet, instantly recognized. Not by face, by energy. Women who had spent months or years being agreeable, being reasonable, being easy to work with, until one day, something broke without sound. I didn't tell them every detail. I didn't name names or describe family politics. What I told them was this: sometimes clarity arrives dressed as a violation. It hurts, it disorients, but it also strips away everything that doesn't belong to you. The day I discovered my wedding dress was no longer mine was the day I stopped asking who I had to become in order to be accepted. I didn't rage, I didn't retaliate. I rebuilt, slowly, quietly, on my own terms, and it changed the trajectory of everything that followed. After the session, a young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, "I thought standing up for myself meant losing people, but maybe it just means finding out who's willing to stand beside you when you do." I nodded, because there was nothing else to add. She'd already said the truth. These days, life feels less about control and more about alignment. Wesley and I still check in monthly with our therapist, not because something's wrong, but because it keeps us honest. Cass continues to host her gallery shows. We attend sometimes we don't. There's no performance anymore, just boundaries that no longer require explanation. Elise and I now exchange polite messages on birthdays and holidays. She recently sent me a link to a designer she thought I'd like. I responded with a simple thank you. That's enough. The Ardent House still holds a place in my heart, not as a venue, but as a turning point. Harriet keeps in touch, sending me updates when something new blooms on the grounds. She once said that old vineyards survive because their roots grow deeper than most people realize. I think about that often. Resilience isn't about resistance. It's about how quietly you stay planted when everything above ground has been taken or questioned. The wedding wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about saying, "I won't hand you the pen just because you've always written the story." I look back at the version of me that thought kindness would protect her, that thought patience would earn her a place at someone else's table. I have no anger for her. She was doing her best with what she'd been taught, But I'm not her anymore. Not because life hardened me, but because it taught me that softness must be rooted in self-respect, or it becomes surrender. I still keep the framed swatch from the original dress on my desk, not because I need a reminder of what was taken, but because I want to remember what wasn't. My voice, my name, my ability to choose what comes next. The most surprising part of this journey wasn't how it ended. It was how it changed my posture in every room I walk into now. Not louder, just clearer. I no longer shrink when challenged. I no longer explain silence like it's guilt. I no longer ask for room. I build it. If you've ever found yourself erased gently, minimized politely, or handed a future you never chose, I hope you remember this. Dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you claim quietly when no one is watching. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight back. It's to redesign the space you were told you didn't belong in and walk through the door anyway. Have you ever stood your ground when everyone expected you to bend? What helped you rebuild without turning bitter? Let me know in the comments, and if you're quietly reclaiming your voice. I hope this reminds you, you don't owe anyone silence to earn your place. You already have one.